I think we will begin. It looks as if maybe that helps. So, Renata, would you like to just say a word or two to introduce Professor Gorman's second lecture, please?
Thank you, Professor. I think I'm going to make the introduction in Portuguese, but
Yeah.
it will be the same that I sent to you, the same ideas, but I will speak shorter this time, ok? Bom, bom dia para todos, né? É um prazer estar com vocês aqui, vários alunos aqui, poder rever, reencontrar, né? E nessa ocasião tão especial, que esse curso do professor Michael Gorman, que ele se prestou, né, a dar para nós de uma maneira gratuita, realmente foi muito generoso, a convite da professora Stamp. E daí estamos tendo, vamos assim, tendo como suporte a equipe dela, que é um pessoal muito bom, muito gentil, né? So we thank you for this opportunity, né, Professor Gorman, Professor Stamp, né? It's wonderful for this opportunity, you know? Pessoal, eu acho que realmente é a chance que vocês têm, né, de ter aula com o professor, que vê até assim as diferenças e as semelhanças com o que vocês estão aprendendo na faculdade, na pós-graduação. O professor Gorman é professor da Catholic University of America, né? É um nome muito importante no campo dos estudos de São Tomás de Aquino e de metafísica em geral. Ano passado lançou um livro que está sendo muito comentado, né? Há várias críticas positivas, né? Sobre é um manual realmente muito acessível e muito interessante, justamente sobre os temas que ele está tratando aqui conosco, né? Então, é uma visão da filosofia analítica, né? Mas que a gente vê que há uma compatibilidade muito estreita com o pensamento de São Tomás. Então, realmente, eu acho que assim todos nós agradecemos, né, toda essa oportunidade, a gentileza desses nossos professores norte-americanos. Está sendo gravadas as aulas, inclusive a primeira aula já está no site Ination Corps. Depois a gente manda para vocês o link da primeira aula. Então vocês veem que eles são rápidos para colocar. Como a professora pediu, deixar a câmera aberta no decorrer da aula. Professor, I told them that the first class is already in the web, no,
Yes.
so they can see it again. No,
Yeah.
it's very good, you know, for the students. No, and we thank you again for generosity. You know, we are to be here with us. Thank you very much.
We are delighted that you are here. And Michael, we're going to turn the floor over to you now.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for coming. This is the second lecture, and I'm going to be talking about what is normally called the problem of universals. And I hope everyone was able to get hold of the outline of the talk, and also there's a little chart explaining or depicting 4 different views, which I'll be talking about a little bit. So first, I'm going to just give a very brief description of what the problem or question of universals is. Second, I'm going to discuss some terminological points, some questions of the words and terminology that we use in explaining this issue. Third, I'm going to talk about one of the 2 classic arguments that gets brought up when talking about universals, the so-called one over many argument. After that, I'll talk about a different argument, which we'll call the linguistic reference argument. And then at that point, I'll be ready to talk about all 4 of the positions. Then I'll briefly discuss, I'll ask the question that at least some of you will be dying to know the answer to, or to hear an answer to, let's put it that way. What about Aquinas? What does Aquinas think about this? It turns out it's been difficult for people to decide. And then in the end, I will say that you may end at the end of this lecture feeling somewhat dissatisfied with all of the options. And in a way, I want to just acknowledge that. And then talk a little bit about it, and then, well, you'll see what I'm going to do. Okay, so first point then, a brief statement of the question. The question is this: are there, in addition to individuals or particulars, individual things like this, or like me, or like you, in addition to those, does reality contain kinds or natures or essences, or you might say universals? So for example, the world contains individual horses, like Secretariat or Itajaro. Does the world also contain horseness, equinity, the nature of horse? Is that also one of the entities or beings, in some sense, that exist in our world? Each of us is an individual human being. Does the world also contain, as an extra, different, special kind of entity, humanity, human nature, human essence? That's the question. Now, I want to say just make a few terminological remarks, a few comments about the philosophical language. The first one is that in this lecture, I will be using the words particular and individual in the same way. Some people distinguish between them. That's fine, but I'm not going to. So I'm going to use them in a way that they just mean the same thing as each other. The second is that I'm mostly going to be using the word universal, the reason I'm going to be doing that is because that's usually the way it gets talked about in contemporary philosophy, although not always. But this is a little bit risky. And the reason for that is that when the medieval authors like Thomas Aquinas and John Duns Scotus, when they talked about this issue, they often talked about the problem of natures. And they talked about the common nature and what kind of status, what kind of ontological or metaphysical status the common nature had. And they used the word universal, but in a somewhat different way. And so it's a little bit dangerous. This will come up again later when I get to the Aquinas part, but you always have to watch out for the terminology. And this is just, of course, a general problem in philosophy. On the one hand, you have to be careful to pay attention to the different terms that philosophers use and read and listen very carefully. But on the other hand, there is no international committee that decides which words are to be used at which times. And so different philosophers use the same word for different things and different words for the same thing. And it gets very confusing. I'm sorry. That's just the way it is. I think it's better, actually, that there is no such international trans-historical committee, because whichever decisions were made, that would foreclose certain philosophical possibilities, and it's better to leave things open. Okay, so the two main topics then are universals and individuals or particulars. That's the main contrast. Now, what are these? In a way, we already know. It seems very commonsensical, but in another way, it's a good idea to try to spend at least a little bit of time explaining more rigorously what they might mean. So here's the way I'm going to present it, which is drawn from the work of my old teacher, Jorge Gracia. So a universal is something that is instantiable, meaning that there can be an instance of it, which is kind of the same thing as saying there can be an example of it. So the universal equinity or horseness, it's a universal because there can be instances or examples of it. Secretariat is an instance of horseness. Itajaro is an instance or an example of equinity, of horseness. And then individuals or particulars are in turn instances that can't have, and there can't be any instances of them. So Socrates is an individual. He is an instance of humanity. and there are no instances of Socrates. If we were to say, oh, so-and-so is a Socrates, that would just be a metaphorical way of saying that they are like Socrates. They're not literally instances of him. Individuals don't have instances. Instead, they are instances. So those are that's an attempt to make those concepts a little bit more rigorous in a way that I hope corresponds to the intuitive sense we have of them already. Now, philosophers then disagree a lot about universals. Some philosophers believe in them and some do not. Now, philosophers who believe in them are usually called realists. And when I say realists, I mean realists about universals. So you can be a realist about a lot of things. You can be a realist about morality, for example, or about the existence of the physical world or something like this. But this is a specific type of realism. I guess it's called realism because you think that universals are real. You think that they exist independently of anyone's thinking or saying anything. They just are there. So people who don't believe in them, philosophers who think that there are no universals, are usually called nominalists, which comes from the Latin word for name. This terminology, unfortunately, the word nominalist, it can be dangerous because people disagree about what it means. And our contemporary usage of it is somewhat different from the medieval usage of it. This will come back again when I get to the Aquinas section. So just be, just be careful. But I'm going to be using it very simply to mean if you're a realist if you believe in universals, and you're a nominalist if you don't. Now, it seems fairly obvious that individuals exist. They seem to be right there in experience. I'm an individual, you're an individual, my little esquilo here is an individual, this coin is an individual. They're all over the place. Maybe, if you want to, you could try to devise a philosophical argument to argue that they're all illusions. Okay, but most people would not say that. I'm not going to be exploring that today. But universals are different because it's not that obvious that we experience universals. Maybe we do, but it seems like we don't. It seems like when we have experience, we always experience individuals. And so if we're going to believe in universals, it's going to have to be on the basis of some kind of philosophical reasoning. And this is usually the case. So realists believe that there are certain ordinary facts, some truths about our everyday experience, and the best way, and maybe the only way, to explain those facts, to explain those truths, is to believe in universals. And nominalists, by contrast, well, sometimes nominalists deny those facts. I'll mention that briefly, but mostly nominalists agree that the facts are there. They say, yes, I agree with you about everyday reality. However, I don't think we need to believe in universals in order to explain those facts. We can explain them without universals. So that is how I'm going to present this basic disagreement. And I'll focus on, you might be wondering, like, which ordinary facts is he talking about? Okay, so I'm going to focus on two, and that's going to give us the two principal arguments, the two main arguments or lines of reasoning that lead people to believe in universals. The first one is called the one over many argument, right? There's one, and then there's many, and the one is over the many. That's the idea. Now, why? Okay, so what's the argument? This is the classic argument, the classic reason. Let's take Plato and Socrates, two humans. Now, it seems clear that they are both human. Plato's human, Socrates is human, they're both human. Now, this fact that they are both the same kind of thing, they both have the same nature, you might say. I'm going to call that real conspecificity. So I don't know if the word conspecificity is a weird word. I don't know if this is written large enough, but you know, they have the same species, they share a species. The con is the with or together part, and this, yeah, okay. So I don't know. I hope you can see it. I hope it's large enough. So if two things are of the same kind, then they are con specific. And if you believe that that can happen, regardless of whether anybody thinks it is true, it's just a truth out there, then you believe in real mind independent con specificity. So it's not a matter of linguistic convention or social convention that Plato and Socrates are both human. They just really are. You need to discover that. You don't make it up. Now, realists accept real conspecificity. They accept it. They say, yes, Socrates and Plato, for example, have the same nature. Then realists argue somewhat along the following lines. Socrates and Plato have the same nature. They have something in common. Well, they can't have something in common unless that something exists. They can't share something unless it exists. And so if they have the same nature in common, then that nature must be real. Humanity exists, otherwise they could not share it. So think of sharing a room with someone. You can't share a room with someone if there is no room. There has to be a room for you to share it. So it's a little bit like that. So philosophers who reason in this way believe that real conspecificity is a fact, and they would say it's an ordinary fact. Just go into the kitchen and you'll see two apples. There they are. They're the same kind of thing. Go to the park, you'll see two squirrels. They're the same kind of thing. Look on your screen, you'll see other human beings. They're all the same kind of thing. It's just a fact. You have to accept it. And the only way to explain it is to say there must be the nature existing. Now, of course, that nature does not exist in the same way as a particular does. Otherwise, we could just see it. So it must be a very special kind of entity. Probably it exists outside of space and time. It's atemporal, and it's not physical. But anyway, it's real. Okay. Now, nominalists don't accept the conclusion of this argument. Nominalists do not accept the existence of these natures or of these universals. But the question is why? And I think there are two main reasons. One reason is that they don't accept real conspecificity in the first place. They don't think it's true that Socrates and Plato are the same kind of thing. They don't think that two squirrels are the same kind of thing. So to illustrate this, okay, so it's probably a good idea for philosophers to read literature now and then. So I thought it would be a good example of bringing in some literature here. I don't know if this book has made its way down to Brazil, but I suspect it has. It's a children's book, One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish. And this is the part I'm going to read to you. It says, it's a very silly book. It just has a lot of silly rhymes. It's a good book. It's fun to read to children. It says, it's just describing all kinds of crazy things with crazy pictures. Okay. We see them come, we see them go. Some are fast and some are slow. Some are high and some are low. Now, this is the important part. Not one of them is like another. Don't ask us why. Go ask your mother. Okay, so that's the important line is this. Not one of them is like another. So this is just a silly book, but I'm using it to illustrate the view that each individual thing is unique and it doesn't share any characteristics with anything else. So I call this Dr. Seuss nominalism. I consider this to be a very extreme view. A more sort of technical name for it is extreme nominalism or radical nominalism, but I'm calling it Dr. Seuss nominalism for fun. I think this is a terrible theory. I think this is totally wrong. But some people believe in it, or at least they pretend they say they do. So I just thought I would mention it. But I'm going to mention it now. It's actually important to mention it because some people think that all nominalists are Dr. Seuss nominalists. They think that if you're a nominalist, then you must deny real conspecificity. It must be that you don't believe that things are really of the same kind as each other. However, this isn't the case. Some nominalists accept real conspecificity. Some nominalists think that Plato and Socrates are both human, no matter what anyone thinks. They are like each other. That Secretariat and Itajaro are both horses, and so forth. But these nominalists say we don't need to believe in human nature as a thing, as an entity. We don't need to believe in horse nature. Instead, Socrates is human all by himself. Socrates has what he needs to be human. He's animal, he's rational. If you're rational and animal, you're human. Also, Plato, he has what he needs to be human. So each of them individually has what he needs to be human. And that's all there is to say. And if you want to say, well, why are they both human? This kind of nominalist will say, well, you don't need anything extra for them to be both human. If the first one is human and the second one is human, then they are just both human. You don't need something extra, humanity as a special kind of being, in order to cause them to be human. They just are of the same kind. It comes for free. It's a free lunch. If you're an economist, you can think of it as a free lunch. I know economists say that there are no free lunches, but this would appear to be an ontological free lunch. Okay. I wish that ontological free lunch were my expression, but I think that's from David Armstrong. Okay. So what I want to make clear now, so just to sum this up, the first main reason why some people believe in universals is that they believe in real conspecificity, and they think that if you need universals to explain real conspecificity. But a non-extreme nominalist, a moderate nominalist, a commonsensical nominalist accepts real conspecificity, but thinks that it is not necessary to believe in universals in order to explain that. Such a nominalist believes that each individual thing is just what it is on its own, and then sometimes they match. This one is like this one is like this. They match, no problem. Okay, so that's the first line of argument. The second line of argument is the one that I'm going to call the linguistic reference argument. This appeals to a different ordinary fact and says this ordinary fact also needs to be explained, and the best way to explain it is with universals. So the ordinary fact is a linguistic fact. It's a fact about how we talk. So we have true sentences that contain abstract subject terms. So the subject term, right, I'm thinking like in the sense of a subject and a predicate. So if I say like, whatever, my hand has chalk on it. My hand is the subject, right? Okay. That sense of subject, not like a metaphysical sense, just a linguistic sense. Now, sometimes the subject term is concrete. It's like my hand, but sometimes it's abstract. It appears to name an entire nature. So you might say, for example, courage is a virtue. Courage is a virtue. Or you might say red is a color. Now, if you say courage is a virtue, when I say that, right, I'm giving a speech. Courage, my friends, is a virtue. Okay, I'm not talking about this particular act of courage or that act of courage. I'm talking about courage in general. right? If I say red is a color, I'm not talking about this person's red shirt or that person's red hat. I'm talking about red in general. So that subject term is an abstract term. Now, one reason for being a realist is you think that we have true sentences with abstract subject terms. Like when I say red is a color, I go, yeah, that's true. Or if I say courage is a virtue. Now, how could I have a true sentence if the subject term doesn't even refer to anything? If I say red is a color and there's no such thing as red, how could that sentence be true? Suppose I told you my dog is small. Now, that sentence can't be true. Why? Because I don't have a dog, you see. So that sentence, it can't be true because the subject term refers to nothing. Well, then, says the realist, if red is a color is true, red has to refer to something. If courage is a virtue, the word courage has to refer to something. Okay. Well, then, what's it going to refer to, says the realist. Obviously, the answer is it's going to refer to a universal. So universals must exist. So that's another argument that a realist can use. And that's also, you see that kind of commonly in the philosophical literature. Now, again, if you're an extreme nominalist, a Dr. Seuss nominalist, then you would say, well, those sentences aren't true anyway. It's not true that red is a color and that courage is a virtue. But I'm not really going to talk about that. So never mind. Other nominalists accept that those sentences are true, but they think that those sentences are misleading. It's in ordinary speech, you're just riding the bus or chatting with people at the playground or whatever, and you say, oh, but of course, we should always remember that courage is a virtue. That's fine. But when you put it that way, when you express it in that manner, it has this unfortunate character. It unfortunately suggests that there's a thing that you're talking about. So the idea here is that the sentence is basically trying to say something true, but the structure of the sentence, according to this kind of nominalist, the structure of this sentence falsely implies that there's a thing that we're talking about, a subject. So that's stated very, very abstractly. So I want to give a different sort of example so you can see what I mean. If I said the tallest student has red hair, there is a specific person that I'm talking about, the tallest student. Okay, so let's, it depends, I suppose, on what class. Let's just pretend this is like a class, okay, and then you're all my students. That's not exactly right, but like, just forget it. So one of you probably is the tallest, right? Maybe there's a tie, but so one of you is very tall. Okay, so in order for that sentence to be true, there has to be someone who is the tallest, right? And it has to have red hair. Now, suppose instead I said something different. I said the average student is, I don't know, 5 feet 7 inches tall, the average student. Now, you might be tempted to think that there needs to be someone who actually is 5 feet 7 in order for that sentence to be true. But that's not the case. If half the students are 5 feet 5 inches tall and half the students are 5 feet 9 inches tall, then it will be true to say that the average student is 5 feet 7 inches tall, even though there is no one who is 5 feet 7 inches tall. And there is no one who is the average student. That's not how that piece of language works. When we use the language of the average student, we're not talking about a specific student. It's just a very compact and efficient way of saying something like, if you add up all the heights of all the students and divide it by the number of students, this is the number that you'll get. Okay, so that little speech about average numbers is only meant to show that sometimes our language suggests that the nature of reality is structured in a certain way, but actually it's not structured in that way. It maybe is structured in some other way. So the kind of nominalist I will have in mind says, yes, we say things like courage is a virtue and red is a color, but that language is kind of misleading. So maybe we should actually say, strictly speaking, everyone who is courageous is, on account of being courageous, virtuous, or something like that. Everything that is red is, on account of being red, colored. And they say, so when you say it that way, then you're no longer saying red with that sort of big emphasis. We no longer have the abstract subject term. Now, the realists say, ah, yes, maybe that works for those sentences, but I have different sentences. And then they go back and forth and have an argument. I'm just trying to point out the nature of the argument. So this illustrates, I think, a general background issue that appears in metaphysics. So if you don't mind, I'm going to just go on a little bit of a sidetrack just to discuss it, because I think it's very interesting and important. The question is, how good a clue is language to the structure of the world? When we analyze our language, does that reveal to us the structure of the world or not? In ordinary speech, we say Socrates and Plato share a nature. That language suggests it's like sharing a room. You can't share a room unless the room exists. So should we say, well, if they share a nature, then the nature exists? Is that the right way to think about this? Or could it be that although we speak like that, the language does not actually commit us to the existence of the nature? And so it's just a general difficult question. When does language give us good information about the nature of reality, and when is language sometimes potentially misleading? And Thomas Aquinas talks about this sometimes. He doesn't talk about it a lot, but sometimes he'll say, we talk about it this way, but that's not really the way it is. So it's a very interesting question, and unfortunately, language is the only way to do philosophy. So we do philosophy in language, and then we have to stop back and ask ourselves, was that a good way of thinking? A good way of, well, it's almost, there's nothing wrong with ordinary language. It's just sometimes it's not going to give us the kind of information we need for philosophy. But sometimes it does. It's a tricky question. And there's no solution in advance. There's no algorithm that you can follow. You just have to do your best. Okay. So I'm done with that section now. Those were the two arguments that people use in favor of universals, the one over many argument and the abstract reference argument. Now I want to talk about four main positions that people take on universals. Two of these positions, or in a way three, we have already seen. Well, okay, so first of all, we've seen extreme nominalism, right? That's the position that I called Dr. Seuss nominalism. That's the view that there is no real conspecificity out there in the world, and therefore also there are no universals. Another view that we saw was the one that I'm calling moderate nominalism, which accepts that there is real conspecificity out there in the world. It's really true that Plato and Socrates are both human, but it says, we don't need to believe in universals in order to explain that. So those are two of the positions. But I said there are four. So far, however, I've only just been talking about realism. So you can guess I'm going to divide realism. And, for the sake of symmetry, if for no other reason, I'm going to have extreme realism and moderate realism. By the way, when I say extreme, I don't necessarily mean that it's bad. And when I say moderate, I don't necessarily mean that it's good. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes, like I hold an extremist position on 2 + 2 = 4. I think it's true all the time, every day, in every country. Call me an extremist. I don't care. Okay, so extreme realism is the view that Plato holds, or anyway, it's the view that people say that Plato holds and that Plato seems to hold. If you talk to Plato scholars, they often say, "Ooh, I don't know. I don't think Plato holds that view." Fine. But I'm talking about the normal view of Plato that we all get when we read Plato for the first time. Okay? This is the so-called theory of forms, the universal natures of things like humanity or hoarseness. They exist in a way that is beyond time, it is beyond space, it is not a part of our world, and individual things share or participate in these forms. So individual humans participate or share in the form of humanity. Individual horses share in the form of equinity. The individuals exist down here in the physical world, and the universals exist, well, wherever they exist. People say in Platonic heaven, which is sort of a metaphorical way of talking about it. But Plato has his own metaphors. If you'll recall from Book 7 of the Republic, there's the allegory of the cave. Down in the cave, you have all the particulars, and then outside in the real world, you have the forms. Okay. Now, so that's an extreme form of realism. It's extreme in the sense that the natures are independent of the particulars, and they exist apart from the particulars, outside of them, above them, beyond them. Now, Plato's student Aristotle spends a lot of time feeling upset about this because Plato was his teacher. He wants to show reverence and deference to his teacher, but he doesn't believe in the forms. He thinks that this is wrong. So he says the Platonists are our friends, but the truth is more important. So I'm going to criticize the theory of forms. And then he sometimes gives a lot of arguments. They're not always very easy. They're almost always hard to understand, actually. Well, anyway, let me mention two of the sorts of arguments that Aristotle gives. One of them seems to be like this. Let's take Socrates and the form of humanity. Now, the form of Socrates is human, right? So the form of humanity, is it human or is it not human? If it's not, then they don't really have anything to do with one another. Who cares what the relationship is between Socrates and the form of humanity, because Socrates is human and the form of humanity isn't human. So then the Platonists could say, oh, I see your point. Okay, so the form of humanity is human. Then Aristotle will say, all right then, if the form of humanity is human and Socrates is human, then they're both human. So they must participate in the same form, some other form. So now you have another form, a third form. This is sometimes what people mean by the third man argument. Socrates is a man, humanity is a man, therefore we have a third man. Well, if you have a third, you're going to have a fourth and a fifth, and it goes on forever, and this is a big problem. Okay. That's one argument. Sometimes I think it's a good argument, sometimes I think it's a terrible argument. But anyway, it's a classic argument. The other argument, and I think this one is sort of more important for us, and Aristotle lays this out pretty clearly in a couple of places. He says the whole reason why we would believe in these forms is because they explain the nature of the individuals. They are causes, they are explanations of the particulars. So the whole point of believing in the form of humanity is that it explains why Socrates is human. We believe in the form of hoarseness because it explains how and why Itajaro is a horse, and so forth. Well, if the forms are what Plato thinks they are, if they exist separately and far away, how can they help? How can they be causal explanations? If they're independent and separate and far away, then they can't do anything. And so they don't serve the purpose they're intended to serve. And they don't shed any light on anything. So Aristotle rejects the Platonic idea of separate forms for this reason. He rejects, therefore, extreme realism. However, on the standard interpretation of Aristotle, Aristotle still believes in the natures of things. He is still a realist. It's just that he thinks that the natures or the universals exist in the individual things. They're not apart from them. They're within the individual things. They live somehow. This is the difficult part. The form of humanity is in me and in you and in you and in you. Each of us has that one form in us. Now, there are problems here because how can one thing be in all these different places at all these different times? Okay, so that's a problem, but nonetheless, this is an attempt to be a realist about universals without running into the problems that happen when the universals are far away and separate. So that is a sort of so-called moderate realism. So if you look at that little chart that I sent, you can see the four positions. There's the extreme nominalist, who is different from all the others by rejecting real conspecificity. And then the second, third, and fourth positions, going from left to right, they all agree with one another about real conspecificity. The two positions on the right-hand side, the two realist positions, explain real conspecificity by appealing to universals, and they disagree with each other about whether those universals are separate from the things or within the things. The second position from the left, the moderate nominalist position, also accepts real conspecificity, but disagrees about the idea that we need to accept universals. It's easy to see how the extreme nominalist view is different from all the other views. It's also pretty easy to see how the extreme realist view is different from all the other views. The hardest part is seeing how the two middle views are different from one another. How is the moderate nominalist and the moderate realist, how are they different from one another? Now, when you write it on paper like that, it seems like it should be pretty easy because the moderate nominalist believes in the universals. The moderate realist believes in the universals and the moderate nominalist doesn't. But I will just report from conversation. I have had 30, 60-minute conversations with people. And at the end, I think the other person and I disagree, but maybe we don't. It's hard to tell. So this is sort of right at the edge of what humans are good at thinking. Yeah, it's a tough question. All right, so that leads me, just checking the time. That leads me to go to the next section, which is what about Thomas Aquinas? And it turns out that people disagree about which view Thomas Aquinas held. I'm just thinking of people right now that I personally know who disagree about whether Thomas Aquinas is a moderate realist or a moderate nominalist. Nobody thinks Thomas Aquinas is an extreme nominalist, and nobody thinks Thomas Aquinas is an extreme realist. But does he believe that the common natures of things have a kind of real status and they exist in all the things? Or does he believe that each thing is individual and it just is also the case that sometimes two things are alike are conspecific. Now, sometimes people try to settle the argument by saying, well, look, if Thomas Aquinas were a nominalist, that would mean that he denies real conspecificity, and we know he doesn't. That's ridiculous. But this is not a good argument because that's not the only kind of nominalism. I mean, if you want to define the word nominalism in that way, okay, it doesn't matter. Now you're just having an argument about the word nominalism. The question is not really a question about the word nominalist. The question is how to understand the position. Now, in case you care, I personally think that Aquinas counts as what on my chart is a moderate nominalist. I think he thinks that each thing is individual. And he thinks that although we can think about natures as if they didn't exist in individuals, they always only exist in individuals, and they have no being, no status, no ontological status outside of individuals. But some other people who care a lot about Thomas Aquinas, some very nice and very smart people, think that I'm totally wrong about this, and they think that Aquinas is a moderate realist. So there you go. I don't know what to say. To me, those people make Thomas Aquinas's view too much like John Duns Scotus's view. But those people think that people like me make Thomas Aquinas's view too much like William of Occam's view. Well, I don't know. It's hard. Aquinas did not spend 5 or 10 pages explaining his views on this topic to us. He had other things that he was interested in talking about. So he just talks about this stuff on the way to going on to talk about the things that he was really interested in. And so we are stuck here trying to figure out on the basis of insufficient evidence. Well, maybe we'll just give up and not really know for sure what Thomas Aquinas thought. But there's a much more important question than what Thomas Aquinas thought about it. The more important question is what's actually the true view. And so that's what we should spend most of our time on. But of course, it makes a lot of sense to think about, to ask what Aquinas thought, because he is pretty smart. So, yeah. And like with philosophers like that, like trying to figure out what their views are make you smarter. They make us smarter. Even if we sort of, in the end, can't figure out what they think, we're now better at thinking about the issues for ourselves. So there's a lot of reasons for studying the history of philosophy, even in those cases where you can't resolve the historical questions. I happen to think this is one of them. Well, I don't think it that much. I'm pretty confident of my interpretation, but I understand that there's evidence against it. Okay. Now, let me say one last thing, and then I'll be done the lecture part of today. I think it's easy to look at all 4 of the views and to feel somehow not entirely satisfied with any of them. So here's a way in which that might happen. Maybe you feel attracted to a realist view. So universals, natures are real components of reality. They are out there in addition to the individuals. But then you might also worry that that gives them a little too much reality, a little too much independence, because this is especially true for extreme realism, but I think it's probably also true for the moderate realist. You might think that if they are really just things that exist and they exist outside of space and time, it looks like it's impossible for them not to exist. They are independent, necessary beings. They cannot not exist. They must exist. And if you think that that's the way it is, then you might worry, well, how do they relate to God? I mean, if you don't believe in God, then this issue doesn't arise. But if you do, then you might think this is a little strange because you've got God and then there's all these other things and God has to just deal with them. God is like, well, they're part of the landscape. I have to deal with them. And you might say, that's not quite right, because God is supposed to be supreme and independent of everything. He doesn't have to just deal with external realities. So that makes the realist, I mean, the kind of realist who believes in God, that makes the realist feel, something's maybe a little bit wrong with my theory, but I'm not sure what. Now, the flip side of it is, if you're a nominalist, I mean a moderate nominalist, you might think this is the best argument. I don't really believe in these universals. They're kind of strange entities. I don't understand how one thing could exist in all the different individuals. But at the same time, I still feel a little uncomfortable, because I know what I said, you've got this thing and you've got this thing and they match, but I feel like you need a little bit of something more to hold them together, to pull them together. They need something to share. So the realist gives us something that brings them together, but that creates problems of a certain sort, because that something is kind of weird and it might challenge God's sovereignty. The nominalist doesn't have those problems, but then the nominalist's position maybe doesn't bring things together enough, and they start to fall apart. So I think actually both of these sides are legitimately worried. If they feel uncomfortable, they're probably right that something is still missing. And I'm just going to stop now and just acknowledge this difficulty. And I'm going to say that I will come back to this question in week 4. And that's all for today. Thank you.